Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football Dill, one of the more wild football games that we'll see in 2024. LSU surviving against South Carolina. One of my biggest takeaways from this football game, this South Carolina defensive line is legit. Like, that was kind of the question mark when you were talking about this football game is, hey, we know that this LSU offensive line is really good. Was this South Carolina defense going to be able to look the same going up against a unit like this? They certainly did. Now, this kind of just came down to who wasn't going to make the mistake and who was going to make the play to win this football game. LSU coming out on top. I want to talk about what we saw, what we learned from both of these programs. Now, before we do, and as always, would love to hear from you guys in the comment section. This was a wild football game. The boys are a little bit fired up, so would love to hear from you guys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. And Dill, looking at LSU first, I think one of the biggest takeaways, I think we found our running back heading forward in 2024 because Caden Durham was phenomenal.
And they needed to find something. You see that Nickel State game. And again, you obviously see Garrett Nussmeier can shoulder the load. I mean, if he needs to throw it 50 times a game, he can obviously do that. I think he can put that LSU team in a position to win a lot of football games. But I think you're right. I mean, you were certainly disappointed coming away from that Nichols game with the lack of balance. In Kaden Durham, I mean, his ability, I think we all kind of thought he was just going to be the track guy, get him in space and let him work. But his ability to work in between the tackles, bounce off tackles, make guys miss in the hole, like really, really impressed by his game.
He reminds me of Blake Corum. Like, Blake Corum came to Michigan as a little bit more of a smaller, speedier back, and Caden Durham was always, pretty thick. He's not the tallest running back, but he's pretty thick, but he was kind of known for his 10.3 in the 100-meter dash speed. Dill, he has the physicality to run the football in the SEC in a very similar way that Blake Corum ran the ball, like that low center of gravity, having that thick lower half, just bouncing off tackles, and also a really good feel for a freshman running back. I think that's one of the biggest adjustments that you need to see is, all right, can you go from being the biggest, strongest, fastest running back on the football field at high school, and then kind of translate that into the Power 5 level? I think
one thing you felt like he kept them out of negative plays. I mean, he kept them more on schedule, and you felt like South Carolina's defensive line kind of did get taken a bit out of that football game by the mere fact that they were much more effective in staying out of that 2nd and 10, 3rd and long kind of situation once they started giving Kaden Durham some runs.
And if you're LSU, like, you have a very good offensive line. Like, you want to have some semblance of a rushing attack. And look, I get it's going to look different from what Daniels brought LSU in 2023, but I think you have a really good offensive line. I think you have a really talented back and a guy like Kaden Durham. I'm excited to see the increase in workload that you see that he gets throughout the 2024 season. Now, I think another conversation to have, Garrett Nussmeier, he made some throws that kind of make a jaw drop. Like, you can tell why LSU loves this kid. You can tell why there are some people in the NFL draft community that see Garrett Nussmeier as a potential top 10 pick. Do you want to see him play a cleaner football game at times, keep the football out of harm's way? Yeah, absolutely. But I think one of the things you learned is that you went on the road against, again, a South Carolina defense that I think is a legitimate defense. And Garrett Nussmeier was able to come up with the plays that he needed to win that football game.
I mean, that throw to Anderson is one of the better throws I've seen. Just to be able to put it up that high, get him right in stride. I mean, just such a big-time throw. And you kind of said it. He was doing that pretty much all game for the most part. He is really, really good. And I don't even know that, again, he was getting his love on the broadcast for sure. And I think college football fans, for the most part, know he's that guy. But, I mean, he is like, I almost want to say a special quarterback because he's so accurate. He's so good down the field.
And I think he's only going to get better. Again, this is a guy that's still learning to be quarterback one. So if you're LSU, like, Brian Kelly's going to, I know dang well Brian Kelly in the press conference is going to say, hey, we didn't play our cleanest football game, but we were able to go on the road and win. If you're an LSU fan, like, you're happy with this win and you're kind of happy the flashes that you saw. You want to see a little bit more consistency from both sides of the football. Now, I do want to give some love to the South Carolina defense because, Dill, I think, again, our biggest question mark was, all right, this defensive line dominated Kentucky in week 2. They dominated Old Dominion in week 1. Can they go out and kind of impose their will against what we think is the best offensive line in the country? I think we got our answer. I'm not going to say they dominated LSU up front, but they certainly look to be one of the best defensive lines that we see in this conference moving forward.
In LSU, I wouldn't say controlled the tempo of that game.
No,
for the most part. And I think we were looking at is like, can they run the ball effectively, consistently? And obviously, LSU started to get to some of that later in that football game. But for the first 3 quarters, it almost felt like, yeah, South Carolina did do a really good job matching them physically, and then obviously making some big plays with that pass rush, with that edge rusher do.
Flipping over to the defensive side of the ball for LSU and South Carolina's offense, the South Carolina rushing attack can hurt you in a lot of different ways. It's nice to see Rocket Sanders continue to get back to form. Obviously, Lenore Sellers going down. The offense didn't completely change. It did become a little one-dimensional for South Carolina in the second half with Robbie Ashford in. This LSU defense, I think, is going through some, what I would probably say is growing pains in terms of the Blake Baker regime and scheme. They are going to be very aggressive. They are going to create a lot of negative plays, some impact plays, which we saw really help win this LSU team, this football game this afternoon. I think there's still some development. Hey, we're going to be really aggressive, but we can't give up those explosive plays that are going to lose you football games.
The issue is they don't quite have the personnel to play the way Blake Baker wants to play.
I think that's true.
You can see them missing tackles in the open field in the past couple games. You've obviously seen them not be able to guard guys one-on-one and go make plays in the football. So yeah, I think you obviously got to see that recruiting get kind of up to the level of what Blake Baker needs, because again, he's putting his guys in positions to make plays, and they made a fair amount of plays. They got a couple of strips, fumble sacks that turned the kind of momentum of that football game. But again, they are giving up too many big plays. They gave up too many big plays today. So I don't know that there's anything Blake Baker can necessarily do. At some point, guys got to step up, make plays when they're
at the very least, though. At the very least, I think you are seeing LSU try to have their defense control a football game. You go back to 2023, it was just hey, we know our defense is a liability. We're just going to play this bend but don't break, but then we're going to break in the red zone anyways. At least Blake Baker's coming in and say, hey, we're going to play my brand of defense. We are going to try to create some negative plays. And again, if you can continue to make those negative plays, those game-changing plays, those strip sacks, those plays that get teams behind the chains, but also not let Lenore Sellers go 70 yards or not let Rocket Sanders go 70 yards. That's kind of the key for this LSU defense. And again, kind of like Michigan, when we went to a new defense coordinator in 2021, you saw some of those growing pains, but as the season goes along and people get a little bit more confidence in the scheme, ideally it gets better for LSU.
Yeah, and again, I think there's certainly a mix. I don't know that the scheme, guys are being put. I still will say that. I think guys are being put in position to make things happen. Again, they just have to make it happen. And that, to me, is a player development. It's a recruiting. It's a having better players on the defense side of the ball. But again, I do appreciate the fact that, and I would imagine LSU fans would too, is it's not like playing scared defense anymore. It's not playing not to lose. They're trying to create havoc, trying to win games. And yeah, you'll probably have to live with a couple of big plays a game that certainly are frustrating. But at least it's not just letting teams take 5 to 10 yards and march right up and down the field every time.
One thing I would add in this football game that kind of took me by surprise, one of the reasons that I was leaning LSU heading in was, all right, we saw LSU's defensive backs, I wouldn't say get exposed, but kind of lose some one-on-one matchups against, I think, some really talented USC wide receivers. One of my big question marks was, can the South Carolina wide receivers create those kind of plays? If you're a South Carolina fan, again, this game sucks to lose. Straight up, I think South Carolina had an opportunity to win. They let it off the hook, so to speak. There are some positive takeaways, the wide receiver position, which was a massive question mark for South Carolina. You saw some really nice plays being made down the field. I thought Lenore Sellers at time was throwing some nice footballs. Again, we kind of knew South Carolina wouldn't be a team that competed at the top of the SEC. But I think our question was, how good can they be? I think we got our answer. This South Carolina team, that's an LSU team that we fully expect to compete for an SEC title. South Carolina just went toe-to-toe. I think a lot of the young talent is starting to get better. Josiah Thompson, he's playing better football than he was week 1 against Old Dominion. And so for South Carolina.
South Carolina, LSU's certainly not the greatest front in the world, but I'm kind of with you. I thought you saw some real bright spots from that South Carolina offensive line. mean, I thought they were picking up blitzes pretty effectively. I didn't think they were just losing one-on-ones like immediately, where it did feel like they were doing that a little bit last year, even frankly in that Old Dominion game. So again, you see that unit coming alive, and I think that is allowing the rest of the football team to show that they're probably not as bad as people think. I mean, this is going to be a tough South Carolina team for, I think, a lot of football teams, because again, some real stars at the defensive back position and the defensive line. And then obviously Rocket Sanders, I was really encouraged to see him make some big plays, because that has felt like something he's been missing a little bit, frankly, for the first couple of weeks.
Yeah, I think if you're South Carolina, again, I'm not trying to get up here and say like moral victory. Like, again, this one sucks to lose.
No, because that's like unacceptable. I mean, Kyle Kennard can't make those couple plays.
Yeah.
Like, those are gonna haunt you, I think, if you're a South Carolina fan. But at the end of the day, I think you're right. There were a lot of, guys making plays that you haven't seen.
Like, this season could have gone in two directions. Like, one, it was either like the young talent doesn't really step up and this South Carolina team doesn't really compete in the SEC, or the young talent does step up and they do compete at a high level in the SEC. And I think we got our answer. And obviously it sucks to not finish this game out for South Carolina, but if you're a South Carolina fan, like, these games are going to be fun for South Carolina in the SEC. We'll close it out there. Appreciate you guys rocking with the boys. Again, if y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all later.